Before we get into the video, I need you guys to do me a favour. Number 1, like the video. Also comment, let me know your thoughts on the story. The cold and brutal murder of Stephen Amos, aka Tekka, and also known as Tunde, turned Manchester into a bloody cycle of carnage and a series of retaliation murders. Stephen Amos was a member of the notorious Gooch gang that began its humble beginnings as a street gang based on the west side of Alexandra Park Estate, situated in the Moss Side area of Manchester. The gang quickly established a stronghold on a drug supply, selling Class A gear such as Coke and H, while Stephen Amos grew up playing football for local Manchester teams like Fletcher Moss Rangers, and in teenage years joining Manchester City. Tekka also built a solid friendship with Manchester United player Wes Brown. They both played for the same local team. Now it was Stephen's older brother Lee Amos, known as Cappo, and his lieutenant Colin Joyce, also known as Piggy, that helped wage a war against the Dodditon gang in order to control a bigger territory of Manchester and also to tax rivals and of course retaliation. Now in a time frame where 25-year-old Stephen Amos was fatally outside the Bexx bar in Old Cross Street, 2 other people had been aimed and 4 people were wounded in a space of a little over 72 hours across Greater Manchester. The first took place on the 15th of February, Friday 2002. A 40-year-old man was fatally in Crumpsall. 2 other people were shot in Moss Side the very next day, and the day after that a man and a woman were both struck when a trigger man aimed at the couple's home in Horwich, Bolton. Now in the early hours of February 18th, 2002, roughly 1 AM, Tekka and his friends were outside Bexx bar when a Mitsibushi Space Star hatchback had driven along Old Cross Street at a slow speed. Now Stephen was familiar across Manchester. He was known. He was an MC and a DJ, where he played at the Havana Bar and the World Club. He was also known to play football, as we discussed earlier, and he was also known for being Cappo's brother, who had a fearsome reputation across Manchester as a man you did not want to mess with. To mess with Stephen was to mess with Cappo himself. Now earlier in the club an altercation took place where shots were allegedly fired outside of the entrance. Around 100 people were leaving the club at the end of the night. When Stephen was outside with his friend, someone fired from the Mitsibushi and ammo struck Stephen in the chest once. Now Stephen's friend was also struck and left in a bad way. Ultimately, Stephen was quickly pronounced dead. The friend, however, survived. The Mitisbushi then just fled the scene. At the time of the Lee Amos and Colin Joyce were in jail. However, the 2 men were furious. They were distraught, angry and hell-bent on getting payback. So they conspired to take down every single member of Longsight crew and the Dodditon gang, as the Gooch gang believed that these were the people responsible for Stephen's murder. Ultimately, in 2003, Longsight gang member Richard Solomon was jailed for Stephen Amos M. For this, he was jailed for life. Still, that did nothing to ease Cappo's pain. Stay safe.